Good morning, everyone. I'm Alan Jones. Welcome to the forum. I was dean here for a while. They call me Dean Emeritus. It doesn't pay anything, but it's very nice to have. This should be a very exciting and frustrating morning because we've got so much to cover, and we have such a distinguished guest with a book that I hope everyone will buy and have at home and read and read and reread. About our conversation then. In the wake of white nationalist attacks, the controversy surrounding Confederate monuments and the contested memories they evoke, the ongoing debate over reparations, and the dizzying swing from the nation's first African-American president to perhaps its most divisive one. Where do we look for perspective, and how did we get it to this political moment? And where do we go from here? As an increasingly polarized America fights over the legacy of racism, our guest today asks what we can learn from the Germans about confronting the evils of the past and at least finding a way forward. Susan Neiman is the director of the Einstein Forum in Berlin. Born in Atlanta, Georgia, she studied philosophy at Harvard and the Free University of Berlin, and was professor of philosophy at Yale and Tel Aviv universities. And she is the author of the contemporary philosophical classic Evil in Modern Thought, and most recently, Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. So please join me in welcoming Susan Neiman.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us this morning. I wanted to start right in the middle of things, and we'll go back to, your own history as well. But you write in your book that I will argue that the 2016 election resulted in large part from America's failure to confront its own history. Can you talk about, now that you live in Berlin, born in Atlanta, what's your message to Americans about history and why we're so backward in that regard?
Well, that's about three questions at once. So
right.
Let me start with the first. It's not a particularly original claim anymore to say that the 2016 election was a backlash to the presidency of Barack Obama. In fact, I just finished Michelle Obama's wonderful book. I think I was the last person to have read it, but anyway, I had a long plane ride. And she herself says our very existence was a provocation. Now, I had to remember this and try and get into the space behind that, because living in Europe, President Obama was the best thing that ever happened to America. He struck Europeans and many people in other parts of the world as the embodiment of the American dream. When I was down south, I had a little party trick to cheer people up. Sometimes I spent about half a year in Mississippi researching parts of this book. And in Ireland, they have made the birthplace of his great-great-grandfather on his mother's side a national heritage site. The ancestral home of President Barack Hussein Obama. And I took pictures to show to people, and they were so delighted because they couldn't imagine how respected and honored he is in the rest of the world. I fear that for an unfortunately largish percentage of the country, the spectacle of the Obama family and the entire family, whatever, you may disagree with this or that policy of his, I do, but we had 8 years of a first family, including the first granny, Marion Robinson, behaving with unparalleled integrity, dignity, and perfection. One of my daughters said, she was about 20 at the time, she said, I can't imagine anything worse than being a teenager in the White House, but to be the first African-American teenagers in the White House, and they did it perfectly. And I think the Obama family undermined any last excuse for racism. So in the sense that Michelle said our existence was a provocation, I believe that that's the case. There is a silver lining, I think. And the silver lining is that the racism of this presidency has opened white Americans' eyes to the depth of white supremacy in this country. Not a word, by the way, that was mainstream 2 years ago. And it's not that we thought that Obama, had brought a post-racial future. That was ridiculous. But we thought the moral arc of history was bending in the right direction. And all of the sudden, this reaction has, I think, forced white Americans to examine our history, to realize how deep this runs.
The president said recently that he was a patriot and not a universalist, not a globalist.
I have a very hard time referring to him as the president, but okay. He did, after all, lose the election. But look, it's exactly correct to oppose those two primary stances towards the world. You're either a universalist or you're a tribalist, okay? Right. But of course, what he misses is the fact that America is one of the very few, and in some ways the only country, not to have simply been founded because a certain tribe landed on a certain piece of ground. America was founded on a set of ideals, ideals which we violated from the very inception, but ideals that are still written into our country and other people's views of our country. I mean, the idea of trying to rewrite Emma Lazarus on the Statue of Liberty goes against absolutely everything that this country, at its best, has tried to stand for.
So what are you? I mean, you're born in Atlanta, you live in Berlin, you're Jewish but sort of universal. How would you...
Well, there is a strong universalist streak in Judaism, okay?
That's true.
There are those two streaks. One is tribal, and one is
universal.
Remember the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Right. So,
yeah, there's that too.
What am I? Oh, I sometimes just say I'm a rootless cosmopolitan Jewish intellectual, which is, of course, a Nazi term, but it kind of fits me. I suppose, and I realize this both when I come back to the States and abroad, I have a very strong American identity, as critical as I am of so many things that happen here. I was brought up on the ideas of the other America. I grew up, I didn't know the history of Paul Robeson, who became one of my heroes, but my parents played the ballad, the Ballad for Americans. I don't know if anybody remembers that. It would be my choice for a new national anthem, except that I'm not sure that, my children would call it cheesy, but I urge you to go and listen to it. It's the only, you can find it online easily, it's the only song that was ever sung in 1940 at the Democratic, Republican, and Communist Party conventions.
Yeah. How do you then have a conversation with something that I, as an immigrant, and love this country, but something I've never understood, is American exceptionalism?
The problem is that so many Americans who talk about its exceptionalism have never been anywhere else, or, maybe they took a trip to see the Eiffel Tower or something. I am always astonished by the ignorance of even very educated Americans about how things run in the rest of the world. It's not entirely, or it's not even mostly, our fault. Most people feel they're lucky to have a 2-week vacation. Not the case in Europe. Few people see the media. I mean, even the good media in the United States will focus on things like celebrity baby bumps, but they will not tell you about parental leave in other countries, and that it's considered not a benefit but a right. And long parental leave, by the way, in Germany, it's 14 months if only one parent takes it, and 16 months trying to encourage fathers to be involved as well. So, you know, when you realize, I said to you before, that Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren would be to the right at this moment in time of Angela Merkel, who's a conservative prime minister, you realize that what our sense of possibility is constrained by all that we don't know about the rest of the world.
Now, there's this long, unpronounceable word.
Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung.
Vergangenheit.
Yeah, I know. Germans like long compound words.
It's a great, but working off the past, working out of the past. What's the biggest challenge then for us? Let's jump for a minute to this whole business of Robert E. Lee and statues and the reinterpretation of the Civil War as a lost cause and all that sort of thing, how we've rewritten that and how recent, comparatively recent that is.
2 years ago, Charlottesville. I mean,
Yeah.
but it's still going on. Look, the good news that I realized in this book, or while I was working on this book, came from my conversations both with people in Germany and with people in this country, because I think the assumption in America where Nazism isn't really studied, it's seen as, you know, the abyss, the absolute evil, you know, something that you cannot fathom. So the assumption is that once the war was over, the Germans fell on their knees and begged pardon from the world and, you know, looked for ways to atone for it. It didn't happen that way at all. On the contrary, if you look at what people were saying, certainly in the first 20 years after the war in West Germany, East Germany was a little different, we can go into that if you like, was we were the worst victims of the war. Oh. Our cities were destroyed, the flower of our youth was murdered, well, murdered, killed, our country was divided, lots of our territory was lost, and on top of all that, those vulgar Yankees are trying to tell us that it was all our fault. So who does that sound like? Right? And the message that I realized at a certain point is that's actually good news, because even the Nazis had a hard time facing up to their shameful history. Nobody wants to look at the parts of your past that you're ashamed at. It's always hard. So of course, when you try to take down these statues, you're going to have people protesting. Of course, when the New York Times does the 1619 project, Newt Gingrich is going to throw a fit. No one wants to do that, and nevertheless, persistently, through civil society, civil engagement, the Germans slowly and fitfully came to acknowledge that they had to do this work. They had to do this memory work. Not that it's been perfect, and it's still ongoing. But I think once you see that, you realize, okay, Americans can do this too, and they shouldn't be disappointed or shocked or whatever when they get a backlash for it.
What about things like slogans? We love slogans about everyone matters, all those sort of things that try and bypass.
All lives matter. So, of course, all lives matter, but that's a way of, so I was trained as a philosopher. We distinguish between empirical truths, truths that are particular and that you find out through experience, and general truths or universal truths. When people say that, they're confusing a general truth, of course all lives matter, with a very particular truth, which is that African American lives in this country have always had less value, and they continue to have less value.
Right. Yeah. Also, the thing I learned, one of many things I learned in the book, is how America inspired some Nazis in terms of the westward expansion, the destructive of native peoples, the eugenics movement, the race laws.
It is quite disturbing to realize, and I learned this myself from a very good book by a Yale law professor called James Whitman. The book's called Hitler's American Model, it's short, that the Nazis studied American race laws in crafting their own, and two things were particularly horrible to me in learning about this. One is they wrote, well, the Americans show us that it's perfectly possible to construct race laws even without a scientific definition of race, which is interesting. But secondly, they thought American race laws were too harsh. They thought the one drop of blood law was not something that was going to work in Germany, so they changed it, and they allowed anybody who had only one Jewish grandparent to not be deported. So the Nazis thought...
They were softer.
Yeah, the other thing that they did in the 30s, when they were beginning to get criticism from people in America, you can see in Nazi propaganda pictures or drawings, photos or drawings, of lynched men. And people say, you know, you solve your own race problem and before you talk about ours. Yeah. So it's disturbing.
What struck me also was how we can appropriate history into our own favor. I was reading about the publication of Anne Frank's journals, diaries, and how they took off in North Korea. Did you see? It was
I didn't see that. Oh, that's interesting.
In the myth of North Korea, they loved her stories because George W. Bush was Hitler in the story, and the persecuted North Vietnamese were the Anne Frank family. The way you could just take any story and make it come out in your favor.
Well, you can, but there's responsible appropriation of a story and irresponsible appropriation of a story. Although we do need to remember about the North Koreans, that more bombs were dropped on North Korea than in the entire Second World War. So that they have a problematic relationship to the United States is something that we shouldn't forget.
Right. That Lost Cause saga always interests me in terms of the South, at least, was much more civilized than the North, you know, much more sort of gracious and so on. And besides, all great civilizations were based on slavery. I mean, the Romans, the Greeks.
That's where all those columns come from. I didn't know that. That was another thing that I learned. The Greek revival architecture in the South was making a statement. It was saying the first democracy and the flower of Western culture was built on slavery. That's what they were broadcasting.
And how do we break through that? I mean, I grew up in England, I'm working class background. Many people, you'll get tired of my saying this, in that the prejudice was so deep. At least I'm not Irish, or at least I'm not Italian.
I spend my summers in Ireland. I love Ireland. But,
you know, that kind of prejudice. Natural.
Sure.
I mean,
you see in the States, by the way, in the mid-19th century, signs no blacks, Jews, or Irish.
Yes, Irish need not apply was a statement in the newsagents when they're advertising rooms to let and things like that.
Right. So the question, I'm not sure which question you're asking, how we break through this?
Yes, I mean, how do we get to universalism in a generous sense, and at the same time celebrate our unique contribution?
Look, I do think we're beginning to break through it. I really think that the silver lining in this presidency is how many white Americans are talking about the lost cause and white supremacy in a way that just 3 years ago was not the case. 3 years ago, and if I criticize Hillary Clinton, I was guilty of the same ignorance. Hillary Clinton was asked who her favorite president was, and she said Abraham Lincoln. Fine, could be everybody's favorite president. And she said because if he hadn't been assassinated, there wouldn't have been all that mess with Reconstruction and Jim Crow and all that. Now, I don't think anybody would see somebody's shaking her head. I don't think we'd make that mistake anymore, but I think for white Americans who were not historians, the period between the end of the Civil War and the Montgomery bus boycott was a blank. It was not something that we learned about. And in that blank came this Lost Cause saga, which we didn't even know to call it that. Hollywood, I mean, the first Hollywood films were Defenses of the South, Birth of a Nation, Gone with the Wind, but those weren't even all of it. I mean, I looked this up. There were huge numbers of Hollywood films that accepted this Confederate saga. My recent epiphany, which I'm quite disturbed by, actually. I was driving along the highway, the New Jersey Turnpike, I think, this was last fall, when I was in New Jersey for a conference, and a song came on the radio that I really like, and I sing along in the car with the radio and all this. It's The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. Now, that song was written by Bob Dylan's band. Dylan went down to Mississippi when it was dangerous to go to Mississippi. It was covered by Joan Baez. Joan Baez went down to Selma when it was dangerous to go down. So, I mean, these people's civil rights credentials are just fine. And yet, it's an elegy for the Confederacy. And I realized I can't sing that song anymore. So, I mean, it's not just, what if I were listening to somebody singing The Night They Drove the Wehrmacht Down, So it's not even people on the right side of the American political spectrum. It's people on the left had this, rebel, everybody wants to be a rebel, Rebel is kind of, it's got a certain kind of, what shall I say, it's got cachet. You'd rather be a rebel than not.
Right.
And we've all bought into that, but I believe that we are, at least a certain part of this country, is beginning to push against that narrative. And I think we will win. Yeah. I don't know what the casualties are going to be on the way. Right. And of course, I'm sure that we're all worried about that in this particular week.
The real question is how we, I think, respect and enjoy the other, and that strangeness. I came across, not that I read this avidly, but this chapter 2 of Mein Kampf. And
I've never read it. But what does he say?
Well, I've only read this bit of chapter 2. It's Hitler speaking, of course. I was strolling through the inner city of Vienna once, and I suddenly bumped into an apparition in a long kaftan with black locks. Is that really a Jew, was my first thought, because, of course, they didn't look like that in Linz. I watched the man surreptitiously and carefully, but the longer I stared at his strange face and examined it feature for feature, the more there came into my brain a different version of the first question. Is that really a German? Is that really an American? Is that really English? I mean, how do you pass the test for true patriotism? And that struck me as Hitler's conversion, or the beginnings of his conversion to a kind of narrow racism with regard to what it is to be German.
So again, those are a lot of great questions. Let me see where I start in answering them. I was raised as a Reform Jew in the South. My mother was involved in the school desegregation campaign. Okay. I was raised to think that if we're supposed to say once a year, remember that our forefathers were slaves in the land of Egypt, then our place is with the people whose ancestors were slaves in the land of Georgia. That is, being Jewish means having solidarity, but also preserving a particular culture. It took me, I had to grow up and realize this was not quite a majority opinion in the Jewish community. It is a strain in the Jewish tradition. There's another strain, unfortunately, it comes from the same Passover book, the Haggadah. Remember Amalek, in every generation people tried to kill us. Yeah. And Judaism is, of course, teetering between those views of what it means to be a Jew. But of course, Christianity has this very strong universalist strain. In a certain sense, both Christianity and Islam are united in the idea that human beings as children of God are, have fundamentally the same rights and deserve fundamentally the same respect. I don't actually find this problem very hard to straddle. I'm not happy about a certain tradition that we are seeing on the American left, where people are talking about cultural appropriation and only a particular group has the right to celebrate a particular culture. I find this terribly historically ridiculous when I'm old enough to remember that in the 60s it was a fight to get Motown played as music, not as race music, which is what it was called. And it seems to me that the only way to begin to understand another group is to try to get inside their culture, not exploiting it, but understanding it. I mean, literature, music, film, art, those are our ways of understanding each other. And there's, of course you understand it differently from the outside as you do from the inside, but the more we do understand, of course you can't understand every culture in the world that isn't your own, perhaps you can't even understand your own. But the act, and it's sometimes quite arbitrary. I mean, I grew up in the American South, so African American culture has had a strong pull for me, but I happened to discover Ireland, you mentioned, a little more than a decade ago, and I just fell for Irish literature, Irish music, The exercise of trying to learn as much as you can about another culture than your own, I think gives you both respect for the differences and a sense of universality at the same time.
Yeah, I always point out when the English had this notion of tribalism, I said we even start off with two, Anglo-Saxon, you're not just and then that whole mixture of things. You quote an author, Carolyn Emke. She was born in 1967. Being German in my generation means distrusting yourself.
Yes.
Can Americans do the same, I wonder? Hundreds of monuments depicting a noble-looking Robert E. Lee. The old history books left out Native Americans and the horrors of slavery. West German children were left with the impression that history stopped in 1933. So not so now. So is it time to rewrite our national anthem?
Like I say, I would vote for Paul Robeson's ballot for the Americans. And he didn't write it, but he rewrote it. Let's not do everything all at once. We have more important things to get through before we start rewriting national anthems, although I do think that we should. Look, the nice thing about America, and this is easier for Americans than it is for Germans, and I've tried sometimes when I'm speaking to German audiences to say, look, there are parts of your tradition that you can embrace. My feeling is that our relationship to our nation should be like a grown-up relationship to our parents, when you're a kid, you basically take over everything your parents told you. You take over their values. You believe everything they say about the world. And often when we're adolescents, I don't want any of it. I think being a healthy adult involves sifting through the things that you're glad your parents gave you. This value I'm happy to pass on to my children, and I'm glad I was raised this way, and these things I think I'm not going to pass on to my own children. And I think we can do that with our national culture. The nice thing about this country is that we do have this concept of the other America. I once saw a film of Harry Belafonte beginning a concert in the Palace of the Republic in East Berlin in the 70s, saying, "I bring you greetings from the other America." Mm-hmm. And we have going back to whoever you like, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Henry David Thoreau, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Woody Guthrie, and Paul Robeson, and we have heroes. We have people from all different groups that came to this country, whether freely or forced to, who have tried to make America live up to the ideals that it proclaims and in fact violates. And so I think once we work through that process, we don't need to distrust a little bit of healthy distrust is always probably good, just to make sure that you're not falling for everything. But it does not mean, so working off the past does not have to mean, as people like Newt Gingrich would say, destroying the fabric of the nation or destroying the basis for national identity. We can figure out ways in which we want to stand up and be proud of being Americans while also atoning for and trying to work against the wounds, the self-inflicted wounds.
You talk about Emmett Till, for example. That case has come up September 1955 and came up in 2018. And Mississippi, why? That's the thing that I read about. Why is Mississippi so terrible? You say it's got the worst health care, the least wealth, the poorest quality of education, the hatred of Reconstruction, the Southern opposition to government programs to improve conditions, and until recently called the lynching capital of the world. What is it about Mississippi that is so intractable?
Well, the other question is, what is it about Mississippi that's so intriguing? And when I say I spent half a year in Mississippi and was nervous crossing the state line the first time I went there, I do not mean to say that that racism is only a problem in Mississippi.
No,
it's not. But Mississippi is a place where I think the problems of this country are magnified, but also perhaps the promise of it as well. First of all, because Mississippians are totally aware of their history. You can't say that this is America, forget about the past and look at the future. They're obsessed with their past, even if they get it wrong. But secondly, the state is, it's nearly 40% African American. And what that means is you cannot avoid questions about race in the way that there are parts of the country where you can. I mean, New York City schools are more segregated than any place in the country, unfortunately. So why is Mississippi particularly awful? But it's also not. That's the interesting thing. There have always been wonderful, brave people of both races working to change it. It has to do, I believe, with the fact that right before the Civil War, Mississippi was one of the wealthiest places in the country. Cotton was called the white gold, comparable to oil in the 19th century economy. And it was all built, of course, it's not only that the cotton was built on the labor of enslaved and tortured people, they were the ones who cleared the forests. The Mississippi Delta, which is the richest farmland in the world, was not flat as it is today. When you go there today, you just see miles and miles of flatness. It was all a jungle with panthers in it. It was enslaved people who cleared it. So you had on the one hand this wealth and this disastrous poverty, but the wealth was built, of course, on African American labor.
Right.
And there was an enormous tension between those two facts. And after the war, Mississippi was the first state to institute the Black Codes, which criminalized, well, sorry, not after the war, this is important to remember, after Reconstruction, which did grant civil rights. Mississippi was the first state to institute Black Codes to take basically all civil rights away from African Americans, and that continued, as you say, not just well into the lynching of Emmett Till in 1955, but the murder of some of our great heroes, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, fighting for voting rights, murdered in 1964. But it was also the scene of some of the great triumphs of the civil rights movement as well.
We must open it up for questions. I just want to add one more thing, throw one more little hand grenade in, which I'm sure will come from the audience too, is this issue of reparations.
Hand grenade.
So if you could just say in 30 seconds.
No. Not in 30 seconds, but I'll try and do it in 2 minutes. Look, I knew if I was writing a book comparing Americans' responses to our violent racist past and Germany's, I would have to deal with the issue of reparations, and I left it for the next to last chapter because I really wasn't sure what I thought about it. I have been impressed by the work of also a couple of African American scholars, Cornel West, Adolph Reed, who have argued virulently against reparations and said what we really need is social democracy. Right. And I believe we need social democracy too. I would like this to be a country where, as it is in the place that I live, healthcare, education, parental leave, 4 weeks paid vacation, et cetera, are considered to be rights and not benefits, okay? Right. That would be a good thing. But as I did the thought experiment, what would I think that people whose lives were devastated by the Holocaust, would they simply be owed the same social rights that everybody else is, or whether they would need more? I came out in favor of reparations for 2 reasons. I'll be really quick, I promise. Number one, most of American wealth was founded on the slavery industry. If you want to read a really good book that backs up that claim, read the book The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptist. Number two, slavery did not end in 1865, and if you want a really good book on that, right, read Slavery by Another Name. So if you put those two things together, even people, white people whose ancestors didn't own slaves, my folks came over from Eastern Europe in the turn of the last century, know that, need to acknowledge that our wealth and the wealth of this country and the enduring wealth gap means that we were beneficiaries of this long slavery and neo-slavery in ways that we need to step up to the plate for. And the thing is, when I wrote this chapter last August, I'm working my way, you often write things to figure out what you think. I mean, that is one of the reasons you write things. I thought, boy, I have to say this is a matter of justice, but I am putting myself out on such a limb. It's me and Ta-Nehisi Coates, and everybody is going to, think this is a bombshell and, right, not take it seriously. And I did not imagine that half a year later, before my book even went to press, you would have 5 presidential candidates talking about reparations and hearings in the House of Representatives. And this, comes back to my silver lining point. I think we're on the way to to acknowledging our past.
There's some great questions we have, which I hope I can do some justice to. Someone writes, I think of our public schools as the fourth branch of our democracy, for if we're not educated, open and empathetic citizens, what are your thoughts about our educational system?
My thoughts about our educational system is that here's a place we might also take a leaf from other countries. School systems do not need to be based on property taxes. The state can step in so that you don't need to have this vast gulf in quality between schools in a wealthy neighborhood and schools in an impoverished one. Very simple. This is not a law of nature. Other countries, okay, it is the state's obligation to provide a basic level of decent education for all its citizens.
Yeah, there's a follow-up question, really. Has having the book Anne Frank's diary in most American schools helped kids recognize evil? And can you suggest a similar African-American storybook for schools today?
That is an excellent question, partly because I fear that the Holocaust is often used to outsource evil. Evil is something that the Germans did over there, and anything short of rounding people up, putting them in cattle cars, and gassing them at the end of their journey isn't really evil. I think if we are to remember, everybody talks about remembering the lessons of the Holocaust, we need to talk about where the Holocaust started, and we need to be able to apply it to other places. A single book, I mean, I'm thinking of Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, which could certainly be read by high school students. It's an incredible book about mass incarceration and the death penalty, and it is beautifully written. Brian Stevenson is also the person who's responsible for the National Lynching Memorial. I interviewed him in the book. He's one of my heroes. It's a good question. I'll have to think about whether there are other books for younger readers, and I welcome suggestions.
Yes. There's an interesting question, and I wonder about this, about the reunification of East and West, and how has it worked out? Are there lessons for the United States in the East German, West German rapprochement and coming together as one country?
Oh, I mean, it's also a great question, but I do try to talk about it in the book itself because it is very complicated. Are there lessons for the United States? Yeah, here's one lesson. I mean, what you probably don't know, because it never comes across in the American media, is that many East Germans feel that it wasn't a reunification, it was an annexation. Right. And that the East German voices were not heard. There was supposed to be, it was actually written into the West German Constitution, if there was reunification, both sides would get together and write a new constitution. They didn't do it. I do think it's important to listen to both sides. And one of the South's major grievances, and I hear this among really progressive social justice activists in the South, is that everybody's always dumping on the South. Everybody, again, this is a case of outsourcing evil. People from other areas of the United States would like to think it's only a problem there. And it's quite funny because while we've internalized the narrative, the Southern narrative of the Confederacy, up to the point of singing The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, we also have a tendency not to really listen to Southerners. And there are amazing people in the South. And I think it's extremely dangerous to demonize them.
Like Lindsey Graham's accent.
So maybe because I did grow up with Southern accents, so I never really had one myself. I like Southern accents. Okay. I don't like Lindsey Graham, but I like Southern accents.
This is a question I would rather avoid, but I can't. It's the question of the difference in terms of anti-Semitism, the difference between critiquing Israel and not being anti-Semitic.
Oh, I don't
there's
think
a
we
whole
should.
question. What about the issue of the descendants of the Holocaust treating the Palestinian as second-class citizens and so on?
I don't think we should avoid that question. I think it's a crucial question right now.
Good.
And I am actually an Israeli citizen. I spent 5 years in Israel, and I did not leave for political reasons, but I am absolutely appalled at what the Netanyahu government is doing to the Palestinians. I don't support BDS, but I've now made it a rule for myself that if I do go to Israel, I don't do it very often, I go out to the occupied territories with the group of a good friend of mine, Tayush, Israelis and Palestinians working together on principles of Dr. King's nonviolence, trying to create a just peace. And I think it's imperative, and the problem is BDS does veer over sometimes into anti-Semitism. I think it's absolutely crucial to recognize that a majority of American Jews now do not agree with the policies of the Netanyahu government. And there are even many strong voices in Israel, although alas not enough, who are also opposed and who are working against it. So let's remember that.
There's another difficult question. Can you talk about the backlash behind comparing the Holocaust to other tragedies, the uniqueness argument? I had a note here, the Washington Mall has a museum of the Holocaust, but no monument remembering American slavery and genocide. Imagine a monument to American slavery in Berlin.
Exactly. Look, I expected to get much more backlash on that question. I really did. To which my answer was going to be, look, we can't talk about lessons of the Holocaust if the lesson is, well, Germans shouldn't kill Jews in 1942. I mean, that can't be a lesson that we need to remember. And we need to make comparisons, and no two historical situations are exactly alike, of course. I spend the first chapter of my book talking about all the differences. I acknowledge the differences. The funny thing is, the New York Times book review gave my book to Deborah Lipstadt, who's a distinguished historian of the Holocaust. You never get to pick your reviewers, but if I had got to pick my reviewers, I wouldn't have picked Deborah Lipstadt, because I would have thought she would be, I don't know her personally, I would have thought she would be someone who would insist on the uniqueness and take offense at the comparison. On the contrary, not at all. So, I mean, that's again another measure of my sense that this country is changing, that we are open to not outsourcing evil as something that the Germans did, but something that many nations, including our own, had a big hand in.
Yeah, you have a kind of spiritual terrorism. Because I've suffered, you cannot criticize me. My suffering protects me from any confrontation or critique. The notion of the sinless proletariat of Marx, you know, or and racism is evil not because people are good, it's because they're human. I mean, that whole notion of kind of a moral purity, I think that's what's really hard to fathom.
I like the concept spiritual terrorism coming from a clergyman, so
there's a lot of
I'm
it
going to
about.
think about that.
There's a lot of it about. And on that, could you comment on gender equality in this day and age and the impact it might have on the presidential elections?
Look, I'm not a prophet, and I got the last election wrong.
Yeah.
Like many of us.
Yeah, we did, yeah.
So, and I listen in the morning when I'm doing yoga to podcasts and, you know, about the current impeachment questions. And nobody in their right mind is making any predictions right now. So I'm not going to do it either. We are in very strange and very new waters. Do I think that Americans are ready to choose a woman president, which I take it is
behind
the question. In 2007, I read 2 books. One was called The Audacity of Hope, and the other was called Dreams from My Father. And I was convinced that if this man could become president, it would be a blessing for the whole world. And my savvy journalist friends in New York, and I have a number of friends who are really distinguished journalists, said, Susan, you've been in Europe too long. An African-American intellectual is not going to win the presidency of the United States. Now, we forget how at the end of the Bush presidency, W. Bush presidency, people thought this was the worst, many people thought this was the worst presidency in the history of the United States. And I think the combination of the war and the financial crash led Americans to take the leap. And of course, the uniquely inspiring candidacy of President Obama led Americans to take this very improbable step. I am hoping that the crisis we're in now, I have not decided on a favorite candidate. I'm happy that there would be a number I'd be pleased to vote for at this point, but I am hoping that the crisis that we're in will lead Americans, particularly given the sexism coming out of the White House, to say, you know what, let's go for a woman this time. I'm hopeful.
There's a question here from an American Southerner now living in San Francisco and constantly confronted by Californians saying, why are Southern whites so racist? So many extraordinary anti-racist efforts, not just the something center. What is that? The law. Oh, now I can
many. SPLC, yeah.
Got you, right. That whole, that kind of prejudice where you cut off conversation by assuming that someone, because they're from a certain part of the country or they have a certain accent, have all those views.
So, I mean, here is something that Brian Stevenson said to me, which rang true to me very much, because while I think we need to remember our crimes, I also think we need to remember our heroes. The lynching memorial in Montgomery is an incredible piece. You will probably have seen some pictures of the inside, but the interesting thing is there are parallel markers, quite large, that for each county in which the Equal Justice Initiative has documented a lynching. And the idea is for counties to come and take home their marker. And in the way that it's hard to drive through the South without seeing every 2 miles a sign denoting another Confederate battle, Stevenson wants to also make sure that the lynchings are part of the iconography of the Southern landscape. But he also said to me, he said, we need to remember our heroes. He said, there were white people who opposed slavery, there were white people who opposed lynching, and you don't know their names. And the fact that you don't know your names says everything we need to hear. So those people need to be lifted up. And, I'm not sure I'm looking at the person who asked the question. Oh, hi. But I really think it's quite possible to go a little bit on the offensive and say, hey, they're actually... I don't know. I've spent some time in the Bay Area, but it's been a long time. But on the East Coast, when I go to the South, I see more black and white people sitting together at lunch tables.
Yeah.
I see more colleagues hanging out together. I see people who, one of the social justice activists who I worked with in Mississippi said she loved Seattle, but she left it because it was so white. She's white. She's white, and she just couldn't stand, not having, a mix of friends. So push back a little. Remind people that Northerners recorded the night they drove Old Dixie down. I mean, I find this incredible.
I want to thank you for a wonderful hour. I knew it would be as frustrating as I thought it would be. Just as a last one, what haven't we had a chance to talk about?
I think you and the listeners have done a great job of sort of covering most of the crucial things. I suppose one of the things that I have been ending my talks with is the following. I don't suppose I'll need to say that to this audience, but I'm going to say it because I'm saying it to everyone. All of these are questions about how America is facing its history now and how we're going to do it in the future. We have an urgent goal right now, and that is making sure that whatever happens in the next year, and we have no clue, that voter turnout is high and that voter suppression is low. And I have noticed in talking to people who are, especially under 35 or so, they don't know what Freedom Summer was. They don't know who Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were. These are people, white and black, who died so that other people could vote. And it seems to me that the most important thing for anybody, although I'm also thinking of, college students or young people who want to be woke, they want to do something, but they're unaware of this history, and they're unaware of the most important thing facing us in the next 11 months.
What worries me is that people are also tired of history. You quote from an Irish woman, the next commemoration of Irish history should be a monument to amnesia and forget where we put it. And you can see that sort of tiredness of... I want, though, to give everyone...
Ireland is a very, singular and interesting case.
It certainly is.
I don't think this is true of the United States.
That's true. I want to commend this book, Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil by Susan Neiman. We have copies of it at the back. Every family should have one. It's a great read and very stimulating and very challenging, and I want to thank you for writing it and for coming and being so generous with your time. And thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Just some final announcements. Please join Malcolm Young next week when his guest will be Sonia Perkins, one of the subjects of Julian Guthrie's book, Alpha Girls, the women upstarts who took on Silicon Valley's male culture and made the deals of a lifetime, on why it's essential for women to take more control in Silicon Valley. You are, of course, always welcome to attend the choral Eucharist service upstairs at 11 o'clock. I think they're going to bless animals today, are they? It could be quite lively. We want to remind you that we rely on your support for the forum, so please make a gift of whatever you can afford before leaving today. And again, thanks to Susan Neiman for joining me this morning. And she'll be signing the books at the table in the back in a moment. And I encourage you to buy and read this important book.
I didn't hire him.
No, it's true. It's a wonderful book.